In this lecture, we'll be looking at Japanese military offensives in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, following the victory at Pearl Harbor. While Pearl Harbor was a tactical success for the Japanese, the attack on Pearl Harbor was an operational and a strategic failure for Japan. The attack failed to destroy American aircraft carriers. Also, fleet repair facilities and fuel reserves were mostly untouched. But in a larger sense, the sneak attack by the Japanese, as Americans referred to it, really galvanized U.S. support for the war, and the American public became much more in favor of entering the war. Almost simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor was an attack on Guam. It began on December 8th. Guam is the largest of the Mariana Islands, about 209 square miles. At the time of the attack, there were about 23,000 residents. There was no airfield at the U.S. base in Guam. There were about 547 U.S. Marines and sailors. They lacked mortars or artillery. There were a few heavier weapons on some patrol boats. The U.S. had really accorded low priority to Guam, considered it impossible to defend if it were attacked, and the Japanese attack forces came from Saipan. The Japanese invasion fleet consisted of 4 heavy cruisers, 4 destroyers, 2 gunboats, 6 submarine chasers, 2 minesweepers, and 2 tenders. There was a relatively token resistance on the part of the U.S., with about 50 casualties and some 400 POWs taken. This map shows the order of battle of the Japanese capture of Guam. And this map shows the location of Guam with regard to the rest of the Marianas Islands. You can see it's at the bottom center of this map. Another attack occurred, again, virtually simultaneously as the attacks at Guam and Pearl Harbor on Wake Island, where the Japanese met very fierce U.S. resistance. Again, relatively small defense force of about 450 U.S. military personnel. The first attack, the U.S. defenders actually repelled the invaders. They sank 2 Japanese destroyers, and of the Japanese Special Forces units that were attempting to infiltrate Wake Island, about 100 were killed in that first day. Unfortunately for the defenders, there was no resupply efforts, and none in the near future. In the second attack, Japanese reinforcements arrived. There were a total of about 1,000 Japanese killed and dozens of ships damaged by this very fierce resistance. All the Americans involved were either killed or made POWs. This was a tactical loss for the U.S., but quite a morale boost, a very brave defense against all odds, and memorialized in a film dashed out by Hollywood in 1942 called Wake Island. If you're interested to look it up, it's worth a quick viewing. Another of these near simultaneous invasions took place in Hong Kong. This was a British territory at the time of the Japanese invasion. Substantial British troop presence there, about 14,000 troops, including about 2,000 Canadians, although the Canadians were relatively poorly equipped and were not the best Canadian soldiers available at the time. They were kind of rushed into service. An overwhelming Japanese invasion force of about 52,000 troops. The British had very little in the way of air defense, very little naval defense. They had 3 destroyers available, but these had to withdraw very quickly. Incidentally, this was the first time a British crown colony had surrendered to an invading force. Some 2,300 British soldiers killed and about 6,500 POWs. Some of the forces were able to get out of Hong Kong. One of the most significant facets of the Japanese campaign in the Pacific was the attack on the Philippines in 1941 and 42. This map shows the various regions and island groups of the Philippines. The Philippines had been a U.S. Commonwealth dating back to 1935, and prior to that, it had been a U.S. protectorate after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The first Japanese troops once again began arriving on December 8th, although the main landings didn't occur until December 22nd. By the 24th, Christmas Eve, U.S. forces began a strategic withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula, and the day after Christmas, Manila was declared an open city. By January 2nd, the Japanese controlled completely the city, the capital city of Manila. The U.S. plan, War Plan Orange, went into effect. Initially, this was supposed to delay the Japanese. The plan called for delaying the Japanese until the Pacific Fleet got to the Philippines, to defend only the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. The big problem for the U.S. was there's no way to resupply forces in the Philippines after Pearl Harbor. This map shows the Bataan Peninsula, which is an extension of the Zambales Mountains. It's on the island of Luzon. It's a little less than 1,000 square miles in area, the peninsula itself. The current-day province of Bataan is somewhat smaller than this region. Parts of this region are very densely forested and tropical jungle terrain. The Bataan Peninsula separates Manila Bay from the South China Sea and is the key to shipping lanes in the Philippines, one of the major shipping and port facilities. The Battle of Bataan began in earnest on January 7th, and it lasted until April of 1942. By December 24th, MacArthur had ordered forces to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. By April, Bataan had surrendered. By early May, Corregidor surrendered. Certainly you have to give credit to the Japanese for having the ability to resupply, having a superior force, but much of the blame for this really should lie with U.S. officials. They failed to react despite having news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. There was a power struggle where the Chief of Staff of MacArthur, General Sutherland, refused to let the Air Commander Brereton see MacArthur about an air raid on Formosa. MacArthur gets some of the blame for this debacle for failing to protect the aircraft, but the Air Commander Brereton also failed to base planes in the south. He had a lot of the aircraft in the north, so really this is as much a U.S. leadership problem as it was a tremendous success for the Japanese. But either way, the Philippines were lost. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had ordered General MacArthur to relinquish command to his assistant Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. While he has gone down in history, MacArthur that is, as being brave, and his famous line, "I shall return," is an American cultural icon of sorts. Many of his soldiers refer to him as Dugout Doug because he spent a lot of time underground, and some of them were quite resentful of MacArthur, as they viewed it, escaping to Australia while the rest of the forces suffered in the Bataan Peninsula. Now, this may perhaps be an unfair assessment, but this was a common belief among soldiers who became POWs and were forced on this Bataan Death March. Perhaps as many as 10,000 Americans died on this march, and an untold number of Filipinos died on the march to captivity. Something like 70,000 prisoners of war associated with this grim piece of U.S. military history. This map shows the actual route that was taken through dense forest in tropical jungle conditions. The Japanese engaged in what has come down to history as known as a centrifugal advance throughout the Pacific. They hit Malaya, they hit the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Instead of halting and establishing defense and pressuring the U.S. to sue for peace, which was their pre-war plan, the Japanese gambled and decided to try to extend control over the entire Pacific. They planned operations in New Guinea near Port Moresby and against Midway, which, as you can see on this map, is about 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. A very aggressive plan, and although not all of the Japanese military leadership was behind the plan. The Battle of Singapore was another of the Allied losses. And at this point, by February 42, it seemed as though the Japanese might be unbeatable. Singapore had been a British colony since 1819. It was in Malaya, which was a major producer of rubber and tin, which is why the Japanese would be interested in this. Japan, by the way, being a relatively possessing relatively little in the way of natural resources. Part of their military plan involved acquiring some of these natural resources like oil and rubber. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow 500-mile stretch between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra in the modern-day Indonesia. Something like a quarter of the world's trade goods pass through the Strait of Malacca, so it had strategic and commercial value to the Japanese. The British assumed any attack would come by sea, and perhaps we can agree with the British that this made the most sense, and certainly the Japanese had been launching sea-based attacks and seaborne invasions. To the north, there were very few British troops assigned, and they only guarded a few roads. Yamashita invaded, however, from Thailand on the northeast coast. He had a numerically inferior force. They attacked from the north by land through jungle. At the same time, there were military attacks in the sea, and two capital ships of the British Navy, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, were sunk. Some 840 sailors dead. No air support whatsoever for British ships. These were the first capital ships sunk solely by air power on open sea. And some like to call this the end of the battleship era, this shocking defeat of what had been considered state-of-the-art and very important military vessels for the British. Sorry for the pause there. My dog looked like he was going to start barking, and I was trying to shoo him away. The Japanese destroyed many British aircraft on the ground, quickly gained air superiority. The Brits demolished the Singapore Causeway to try to stop the Japanese, but Singapore fell in relatively quick order. This was shocking for the British and a major setback. This map shows the location of Allied ground forces in Singapore at the start of the Japanese invasion. You can see the causeway in the upper left, toward the upper left of this image. One bright spot in an almost endless sea of Japanese victories for the Allies occurred with Doolittle's raid. It was definitely a moral victory for the United States, sending U.S. bombers over Tokyo in the middle of the war. It was very slight damage in terms of structural and deaths, but definitely a humiliation for the Japanese high command. And they were forced to move the date for the Midway attack as a result of this. And U.S. Again gained a tremendous moral boost as a result of this. The Battle of the Coral Sea, another significant battle, and something of a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The U.S. had been able to intercept Japanese radio traffic in an operation called Magic. These Magic intercepts allowed Admiral Nimitz to position 2 carriers off the eastern tip of New Guinea. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Japanese were forced to call off an amphibious attack on Port Moresby, New Guinea. The battle is interesting in part because it was waged exclusively via airstrikes, and opposing surface ships never made direct contact. So this is a point at which Japanese expansion is at least temporarily checked, and it again is something of a turning point in the South Pacific. The Battle of Midway is another key moment for the Allies when they seemingly are able to turn the tables on the Japanese. Japan, interestingly, created a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands while the main force attacked Midway. This did not achieve, however, the goal of startling the United States into thinking that the main attack was going to go through Alaska. The goal was to destroy the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, especially the carriers which had escaped harm at Pearl Harbor. Thanks to Magic intercepts, the U.S. didn't fall for the Alaska ploy, and they instead reinforced Midway. The Americans destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and most of their flight crews. This was a stunning defeat for the Japanese, who had believed they were a nation of destiny and had the initiative and the momentum. And at this point, the war in the Pacific began to turn in favor of the U.S. This chart shows you the order of battle for Midway, the number of ships and aircraft available for the battle, fairly, in many ways, fairly evenly matched. But again, the U.S. benefited from having intelligence advantage over the Japanese. This last map shows you the greatest extent of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific, or as they refer to it, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This would be in 1942, and this would continue to shrink from 43 through the end of the war in 1945.